So, you dug your old console out of the closet, and now you want to hook it up again. Sounds simple, but it can quickly become a pain. Maybe your TV only has HDMI inputs. Maybe you get the console fired up and it looks like hot garbage. I've gotten lots of requests to do a setup video since I started RetroTech Select. And your voices have finally been heard. Just don't get used to it. You guys already get lots of peeks at my game collection, so let's jump over to the hardware. Why'd I have to say jump in? Too old for this crap. My main setup is centered around getting old consoles looking decent on an HD display, which is easier said than done. The first group of consoles we're going to look at makes that task easy. The Retron 77, AVS, and Mega SG are all clone consoles that play original Atari, NES, and Genesis games over HD. The quality for each of these varies, but I'll link to my reviews in the description. Below the clones are my PlayStation and PlayStation 2 consoles. Don't ask me why I need both when the PlayStation 2 is backwards compatible. I just do, okay? Moving over from those are my Sega consoles, which include a Genesis Model 2, a Sega Saturn, and a Sega Dreamcast. And below those are my original Xbox and Xbox 360. Don't forget me! All the way down at the bottom are the Wii U, PlayStation TV, and PlayStation 3. And last but not least, the digital joys of my youth epitomized in the Super Nintendo, N64, and Nintendo GameCube with Game Boy Player. And now we get to the stuff I'm really passionate about. All of these consoles have to get to my display somehow, and a lot of them are either incompatible or look like total trash on a modern display without some sort of device in between. The first step in this process is making sure you have a clean source to feed into your scaler. For me, this meant upgrading my cables. I highly recommend using HD Retrovision component cables, since they're compatible with the rest of the equipment I'm using and the picture quality they produce is outstanding. Once you have good cables, you have to feed the signal to your upscaler, which I do with a pair of mechanical GE component switchers. They're a little hard to find these days, but they get the job done without adding to the rat nest behind these cabinets. Now that you have a way to feed multiple sources to a single output, you can start the process of upscaling your video. I now use an OSSC as my primary line doubler, with all of my 6th generation consoles feeding into input 3, and my older systems going into input 2 via the RetroTink 2X and a cheapy component converter. Using the 2X as the transcoder gives me a lot more compatibility with finicky devices like the Super Nintendo, and it lets me use S-Video with my N64, which is as good as an unmodded 64 can manage. I would go into more detail about why I chose the OSSC in the first place, but that's another video unto itself. Once the retro systems get upscaled by the OSSC, they join my HDMI consoles like the 360 or the clones we covered earlier at a powered HDMI switch box that feeds into my Denon AVR 1913. The Denon is a home theater receiver that I actually used to leverage as my primary upscaler when I first started this channel. Due to its poor handling of 240p content and incompatibility with some of the prime offenders, I've gradually swapped other scaling solutions into the mix. Sitting above the AVR is a Blu-ray player that does just what you think it does. Before we leave this main entertainment center, I wanted to go over a few questions you're probably asking yourself. First up, yes, this cabinet is actually 4 IKEA stands stacked together to make one unit. I've had a lot of different looks for this setup over the years, and though this one is still a bit janky, I'm happy with it. I was also able to tame the tangle of wires you see poking out between the consoles a bit by employing some J-channel at the back. This may still seem like a fire hazard to a lot of you, but I assure you it's much cleaner than it has been in the past. Secondly, with all these consoles, there isn't much you can do about the sheer amount of controllers around, other than throw them in a basket. I actually have 5 different controller baskets in this place. That's not to mention the confusing array of controllers for the setup itself. And now for the third big question you've probably been asking, where the hell is the TV? Long story short, there isn't one in this room. I have all of this equipment piping over to a BenQ W1070 projector. For those keeping track, my oldest consoles go through a component switcher, into the RetroTink 2X, into a component converter, into the OSSC, through the HDMI selector, through my receiver, and then the signal gets split off into these 2 devices. This hobby can become a rabbit hole real fast. I chose the W1070 as a projector explicitly for its variety of legacy inputs and its relatively low input lag. It's not quite as fast as the speedier TVs out there, but I get the home theater experience for my movies, and I get to live out a lifelong dream of playing video games on a giant screen. The capture card I'm using now is the StarTech USB 3 HD cap. I picked this one out specifically because it handles the higher line multiplication modes made possible by the OSSC, which basically means I can take full advantage of all this schmancy gear when capturing game footage. Speaking of, let's take a look at the place where the actual editing is done for RetroTech Select videos. Okay, so we're back on the RetroTech Select set, and what you might not have realized is this room is actually its own set of consoles and workstations. On the CRT, which I got for free, I have older equipment like my Commodore 64, Model 1 Jenny, NES toaster, and a Super VHS VCR hooked up via S-Video and composite. Gross, I know. On this little enhanced definition 480p LCD, I have a DVD player and a Wii hooked up via component. Don't tell the guys from HD Retrovision, but I'm still using cheapy generic cables on this thing. Just to the left of my LCD setup is my gaming laptop / editing station.
This is where I settle in to make that sweet, sweet video content.
I actually have a dedicated capture setup for the devices in this room, made up of my previous set of scalers. Composite and S-Video footage goes through the iScan Pro for line doubling, and then gets upscaled to 1080p by the Atlona for capture on my Elgato Game Capture HD.
I've actually found myself playing on this setup quite a bit lately, so I'll probably throw in a couple more consoles just for convenience.
Which brings us to the final part of the tour, the game and movie collection. On the left-hand side of the set is my collection of Blu-rays, DVDs, and even a couple tapes down at the bottom. I do have to take a moment to lament that most of my DVD collection lost their boxes to the convenience of carrying cases when I was in college. Really wish I could still have all those titles on full display. As for my game collection, I used to be in the habit of selling all my old games and consoles when I moved on to a new generation, meaning I've now invested a lot of time and money in rebuying games that I already owned previously, which is a major bummer to be sure. As for organization, most of my disc-based games are located here in the back of the set. In the center, we have PS1 and old PC games. Genesis, Saturn, and Dreamcast games are at the top right. Below that are GameCube, Wii, and Wii U games. That brings us to my exploding collection of Switch games, which is really the only modern system I'm buying for right now. Followed by Xbox, Xbox 360, PS2, 3, and 4 games, and a small handful of games for Sony and Nintendo's more recent handhelds. That paltry portable lineup is definitely something I want to focus more on collecting in the future. Even my Game Boy collection is pretty modest, being confined to a small craft box that I converted into a hanging wall display. And that brings us to cartridges. The majority of my carts are stored in this little media shelf that I got from a thrift store for a couple of bucks. At the top, we have an assortment of Atari 2600 games, followed by a few shelves of NES games, Super Nintendo and Super Famicom games, and finally my little collection of N64 games. And that's it for the tour, folks. I hope you had a great time checking out my collection, and maybe have a better idea of how I capture the footage that goes into making these videos. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in the next RetroTech Select.